All right, welcome back to In the Future. And today we actually have a special guest. Obviously, you got me, Spencer, you got Max, but you'll notice a third person here. And this is our friend JC, who's actually come to join us on our conversation that involves something that is sometimes, pretty heated, but I think ultimately an important conversation, can be vibrant, and it's about immigration in modern society, but not so much about whether it's good or bad. That's not really what we're here to discuss. We are all pro-immigration. We all have ties to immigration. What we're more here to talk about is really the different components that come around what modern immigration has, and hopefully talk about some positive solutions that can make everybody live in a world that's much better, right? So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to JC here to introduce himself very briefly and give some initial thoughts, because he's reading a book. I think it's 21st Lessons for the 21st Century, and that's what inspired this conversation. So hey, JC.
Hey, man. Thank you for having me. Introducing myself. Okay, so I'm JC Soletta. I've lived in 4 different countries, with the U.S. being the one that I've been living in the past 8 years now. I did Miami the first 2 years, now New York for the past 6. And as you pointed out, this is a topic that I've, of course, grown interest in, being an immigrant myself in several of these countries. And it was also prompted by having read the 21 Lessons for the 21st Century book. And what was most interesting to me, as you pointed out, is not the fact that it's looking at immigration from the angle of, is it good or is it bad, which is a topic that, as all of us know, is front page nowadays in every single newspaper and news outlet out there, but more like, what does the immigration deal, or how should it look like? And it approaches it from 2 different angles. The first one being, is immigration a privilege a country extends or an obligation a country has? So should it be understood as a duty or as a favor? Mm-hmm. And the second one being, if there is indeed an immigration deal between 2 parties, refugees and the country that is hosting them, once allowed in, do immigrants have an obligation to assimilate into the local culture? And with everything going on, especially in the US, but also in Europe as well, I thought it was such a thought-provoking thing think of, that I thought it was a good topic to bring to today's episode.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Very interesting stuff. First of all, I should get the book myself, because I do want to read through this topic and others. So what are some of the first things, if we can start with the first one, which is it a duty for the host country to be that kind of embracing body that allows people to come, or is it something that they can, or a privilege? So what are some of the things that you've taken away from reading that book or chapter that stick out?
So, I mean, I don't think that anything the book shares is really groundbreaking. I think it's all ideas that we all have in the back of our head, and we really haven't sat down to actually think of. But if you ask me, and again, having been an immigrant myself, I think that no country is really obliged to accept anyone in. And if they do decide to open their borders, just like they decide on different things that every country should abide by, whether it's religion, whether it's language, whatever it might be, it does make sense to allow a country to ultimately decide whether they want to allow immigration in or not. That is, that exceeds whatever stance I have on the topic, being pro-immigration myself. But I do believe that if a country decides to extend that invitation to immigrants, it is a privilege, and people should understand it that way, just the same way that I've understood it when it has been applied to me throughout my life.
Yeah.
And countries are not really obliged to do so.
Yeah, I can see that. And why would you think, what's one of the reasons you think that countries aren't obliged to? And I'm going to give you my take in a second as well.
Yeah, of course.
I'm curious. Yeah.
Why do I think they're not obliged to? Because at the end of the day, the same way that we divide territory, and whether it's cities, states, country, whatever it is, and each region, territory gets to choose their own rules, part of those rules is immigration. And part of those rules is whether you drive on the left or on the right, whether English is an official language or whether it's German. And ultimately, one of the angles that anti-immigrationists have, which I don't agree with to a great extent, but I do agree with this specific thing, is a country should not be held responsible for the mismanagement, if you want, of other countries. So if a country like Germany does a fantastic job in the past 40 or 50 years to provide their people with education, and paying their bills on time or whatever it might be, to just keep it as simple as possible, they should not pay for, quote unquote, the sins of other countries. And I would even tie it to this not being solely an immigration issue. It's also an economic issue.
Mhm.
A question that I always bring up when this kind of debate comes up is, being a pro-immigration person myself,
Mhm.
resources are scarce. They're limited. So I think we can all agree that the US has the capacity to absorb 5 million people or 10 million people or 15
Very
million.
likely, yeah. Space, especially with the space
Exactly.
resources.
And the resources and everything. But if 200 million people decided to come in at the same time, I think that even the most pro-immigrationist would agree that that is a number that the country can simply not absorb from a resources perspective. So an economic issue alone is, I think, something that countries could use as an argument to say, I get to draw the line, whatever it is I want to draw it. And
Yes.
ultimately have people or immigrants abide by it. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. I think a lot of that makes sense. And myself, part of me, like, just to kind of respond back onto the whole statement that you said, like, part of me is like the hippity dippity in me, hippie inside of me is like, yeah, these are imaginary lines. Like, we should be able to go all over the earth, and who's to say this human construct of borders? But the reality of me is also like, well, there needs to be some level of order, and especially when you've established rules within a specific geographic area that creates the stable world that we live in today, you need some level of regulation and procedure in order to keep the greater peace. So I agree. Generally, I agree with you as well. Whereas, like, I think it's not it's not a duty per se. I think it's more of like the country's not, it doesn't have to really pick up on the responsibilities of other countries' failures in certain regards. That being said, a conversation that may come up a lot, somebody who would want to play devil's advocate in some regard to this, is the US is a great example. Some people would say, well, they're involved with the Nicaragua, which I know you must know some closely.
Yep.
So some tie closely, the Nicaragua Civil War, or let's say Venezuela, or Cuba in this. Let's use Cuba in this example. That was the U.S. caused that mess. So how can we say no to the people that are coming from those countries, or like El Salvador, and with France, with Algeria, and like the Middle African countries. Hey, France is somewhat responsible for the situation those people are in. Why not let them in? But like that's like the caveat, I would say,
Yeah.
that usually pops up with the pro-immigration groups, and that argument of like, we're not responsible for another country's mess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Max, I don't know if you have a feeling or if you want me to jump in.
Oh, I have lots of feelings. all very interesting points. The one that really catches my attention is one of the last things that you said, JC, where there's a ratio where if too many people immigrate at the same time or just over the years, it kind of loses the reason for why that country was attractive to people to immigrate in the first place, right? So if people, let's use America as an example, for a long time it's been this like shining beacon of democracy, and that's why so many people risk their lives, even die on the way to immigrate here. But if so many of those people immigrate and we don't have any rules in place to cap that number, you kind of change the actual, like, the structure of the country and the reasons for why people immigrated. So that's also, other than the natural resources, which are scarce, that you have to remember, like, the actual character and the reason of why you want to immigrate here in the first place will get diluted. And so that's something to consider as well.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is like the resources in terms of not even just like food or space. It's just people need guidance when they go somewhere new. Like, if I move to, let's just say I moved to Japan, right? I need some sort of social guidance in order to really have me navigate that society, right? Like, I can't read Japanese. I'm not going to go there assuming people speak English. I need some sort of guidance to be accepted. What are the etiquettes when I go to work? How can I make my quality of life higher in Japan? Now, when you have an influx of so many people at a scale that's unorganized, it becomes harder to guide those people into positive improvements in their lives, because typically what they do is they fall into, not generalizing here, they'll go into neighborhoods or areas that are just maybe more impoverished automatically, which is, that's not the worst thing in the world, but The bad thing is that it makes them be around other people who are also in the same scenario, and they don't really reap the benefits, like Max said, that they came here for anyway from the very beginning, right? You just go into an enclave, an impoverished enclave, you stay there, and you don't necessarily improve because you're not around the people that are been in the country prior to you, regardless of race or culture of their background. You're not going to be around the people that are going to pull you up and say, hey, welcome to the neighborhood. This is how things are around here. We can help you find a job. Welcome. But when you're just in another group of mass numbers of people from the origin of your country, what's the big difference apart from, the laws applying to you that are American or whatever country you immigrate to?
Yeah. And I think that's a great segue to the second question, which is, should immigrants adopt, or do they have an obligation to adapt the local culture or not? And it's so interesting because I don't remember exactly how it was expressed in the book, but it does give examples of two different countries, of Germany being one, Japan being the other one. So Japan, usually not very open to immigration. I went to Tokyo not that long ago, I think a year and a half ago, after you very much pushed me, Spence, to go, and I ended up loving it. But they have a very low immigration rate. I think it's like 97% of the country is Japanese. And part of the reason why they've been able to become such a developed country is because there's this social contract among the people that things need to work in a certain way. And that vision has allowed them to move forward collectively. In some other cases, like Germany, there is more multiculturalism, but at the end of the day, those bases or pillars for what the social contract should look like are still very much there. So going back to Max's point, it does raise a question of like, okay, what happens if you approach it differently? He was just saying, a lot of the reason why people go into any country, they immigrate into that country, is because it looks a certain way. But if people don't adapt necessarily to the way that things are in that country, and instead they all just simply come with their approach, the fundamental nature of that country will change. And that differs from the country that they were looking to go into, right?
Which is very logical, by the way. That equation makes sense.
Yeah. And also, like, I'm open to be proven otherwise, but the reason why any society has advanced is through organization. And if we don't agree on specific rules that we should all abide by or live by, then it's very tough or difficult to be organized and move forward collectively. And this is something that you and I, Spence, have, spoken about before, but to me, and again, I'm more than open to be proven otherwise through compelling arguments, but it's pretty straightforward that anyone that moves into a different country should, to a great extent, try to adopt the local or assimilate into the local culture. I've never really understood, especially in the US, yes, we are a melting pot, and we should not we should never ask people to change their DNA or who they are as people and the culture or the customs that they have. But at the end of the day, there's fundamental principles that we all need to agree to. And having seen some examples myself in the US, like, that is a little bit of counterintuitive to me. The example that comes to mind is, I pretty much lived all of my life in Spanish-speaking countries until I moved to the US 8 years ago, even though there's a joke that says that the best thing about Miami that it's very close to the US, so it doesn't really feel like the US when you're there. But having moved to New York 6 years ago, it's very interesting how people, in many cases, when I introduce myself as JC instead of by my full name, which is Juan Camilo, they try to convince me of like, hey, no, like, you should force people to call you by your full name, Juan Camilo. And I've never really understood that, because to me, even though the US doesn't have an official language, despite what a lot of people might think, it being English, we don't really do have an official language. I know that it's easier for everyone that I speak to just address me by JC, because English is the language that the majority of us speak. So I don't try to see it from an angle of, I'm going to impose my vision or my way of doing things because the country should adapt to me. Instead, I think of it the other way around, which is, I'm going into a different country. I should be the person adapting to this country. So I adapt my name to make it easier for anyone that is quote unquote local to be able to address me. And I don't take offense by the fact that they don't call me Juan Camilo. If they decide to do so and they go out of their way, I commend them for doing the effort, and I think it's a good thing, and it shows respect and a will to learn, if you want, a willingness to learn. But I don't think that they should do so. I think it's nice that they do so, and I think that this approach is a way that immigration should be looked at as a whole. But maybe, again, I'm open to a different interpretation.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in just kind of even a simple metaphor, which I know some people might think I'm oversimplifying here, but it's like if I go to Max's house and, he's the type of household that wears shoes in the house, and I take the shoes off in my home, I will keep my shoes on when I go in his house, right? Because I'm not going to be like, maybe he doesn't want to see my stinky feet and socks when I go to his house. So I'm going to adopt. I'm going to adopt. I'm not going to go against him. Or maybe, I know that Max doesn't like to use utensils when he eats dinner at all. So maybe I'm not going to force my ways of fork and knife on him or chopsticks on him. So, it's his way. So, hey, we'll do it at Max's house how Max wants to do it. I'll wear my shoes and I'll eat with my hands I'll have my cereal bowl with my hands at his house. So that's something like that, right? You don't make people, you don't force your change on people's homes, right? Because countries are more or less people's homes. Yeah. So I can see that. And the last note I'll say really quickly is that assimilation, to me, like you brought it, it's like a lot of people like to think of assimilation as like, oh, and they love to say this word, you're whitewashing. How many times have I heard that? You're whitewashing, which is also very toxic, by the way, to say to people who are trying to really they're like just for talking a certain way or for, because you're a POC, a person of color. Technically, I'm a person of color. If you guys don't know or haven't picked up on it. And the many times that I said, because I sounded intellectually, that I had the words say, you're whitewashed or you sound, how toxic, obviously it didn't really affect me, but the idea that you have to sound a certain way is crazy. And I think a lot of people associate that with assimilation. On top of that, they associate it with like losing your original culture, right? Like, oh, so like you come from, let's say in this case, Turkey. Oh, you're going to lose your Turkish culture. I'm not Turkish. You lose your Turkish culture, Colombian culture, if you want to use me. Yeah. Which I did an immigrant in a second. My mom is an immigrant, but you're gonna lose your culture. No, assimilation simply means we have a collective value that we can all share. Like assimilate to those values, respecting others in certain ways, right? Maybe we don't we don't stone people in this country. Those are kind of like these social agreements. Don't necessarily mean that you need to erase your identity, your cultural identity. It just means you need to embrace being, the rules and the etiquettes of the streets. Don't spit, don't take a crap on the street, like those type of things.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it, Spence, because one of the arguments that usually is used for this is to say like, no, we should allow people to, bring their culture and just be their true self. So whatever that is, because drawing the line at any point is a form of discrimination, whether it's racism or culture,
100%.
whatever it is. But to me, how strong an argument is defined by by you taking it to the extremes, right? So I think we can all agree that maybe my previous example, the one of using my name, some people could say, well, no, if it's your actual name, Juan Camilo, then you should force people to call you Juan Camilo, not JC. Sure, That is a very simple example that I think we can all, in some way, shape, or form, agree to, right?
Yeah.
What about the other examples as you start, pushing that a little bit further? Like, how do those play? An example is if you come from a country where, let's say Saudi Arabia or whatever it might be, where women are looked at in a very different way. You're not supposed to be, your independent self, but you're there to serve a man. Like, would we in the US, who have a very liberal, progressive point of view where women are equal to men, like, would we allow those kind of things in? Or should we allow those kind of things in?
Right. I think to some extent, like, can we allow it at the individual level? Maybe at your family level, that's okay. Like, if you want to do that with your family and your privacy of your home, that's okay. But as soon as you step outside, that's where that should not be allowed, right? Because that's not just cultural. Now that can draw also the line of like human rights. Like it goes beyond just cultural. It's like you're on a street where the law allows, in this case, women to be free, and you can't really enforce your will as a husband outdoors, right? Yeah. You can do that in your privacy of your home.
Yeah. I love the fact that Harari, the author of the book, he makes a very clear distinction between racism and culturalism. The difference being, if you judge anyone by their race, like, that is something that they cannot change. That is intrinsically bad. I think we can all agree that labeling someone as good or bad simply because of the color of their skin is absolutely terrible. But there are cultural differences that we can all agree, especially with human rights, are things that we should either change or some that are better than others. An example, we were talking about that before, but if you stone someone or just thinks differently, or thinking that women, just for the sole fact that they're women, are inferior to men, like those kind of things, he's very careful of labeling culturalism, because cultures are dynamic, they evolve. Like even the US culture was, we're pretty progressive nowadays, but if you look at how the US looked like 100 years ago, women had just gotten the right to vote. It was, by modern standards, not a progressive society. So
a lot of other things too.
And it takes more time in some cases than others. But that distinction, I think, is key, because in many cases, people are afraid of labeling something as, we don't want that. Well, sure, let's allow immigration, but let's draw the line with specific behaviors, because they're fearful of it being labeled as racism, when it's not really racism. It's culturalism. There's a difference in cultures. And if we're aiming towards a more inclusive society where, the only thing we should judge is the content of your character, not your skin, your gender, whatever it is. Like, I do think that a country has a responsibility to protect that progress that they've made. And therefore, if it is to allow immigration in, whether that is a US, Europe, whatever it is, they should request that these immigrants, whether it's you, me, someone else, we abide by the rules that the country now has. And I think that to me is pretty simple.
Yeah.
But again, I'm always open to hearing different arguments that might persuade me to think otherwise.
I think that everyone should assimilate, but assimilate to a certain degree, right? I think it's very hard to, even if you upfront, before someone is allowed into the country, you say, like, sign here are the rules that you're agreeing to.
Yeah.
That's very challenging, right? But it's expected that the values are at least adopted, right? Culturalism is a very interesting concept in itself, right? If you apply that to the culture at a job, right? If I was applying to Google, I would probably only apply, or Google or Netflix. If let's say Netflix, because it's more hardcore with their culture. If I was applying to them, I would expect that I would have to change some things about myself before I joined, right? Otherwise, I'm not a good culture fit. I'm not a good culture fit for them. They're not a good culture fit for me.
Good point,
right?
With work, yeah.
Yeah. And so is immigration to a country any different than immigrating into a new job or a new country? Probably
Right.
not, right?
Probably not.
And, yeah. And I don't know which one of you said it, but I agree. It's all about being a little bit flexible, like in all things in life, right?
Mhm.
You could either be like, I was just reading like a Bruce Lee book a couple of months ago, so it's fresh
Be like
in my
water.
mind. No, be like water, but more like be like bamboo instead of the oak, right? Like be a little bit more flexible. Otherwise, if you're right, and like you won't break in the wind, like JC with his name, like if maybe to someone else, not maintaining your name, like your ethnic name, is offensive, but to some people like JC, it's a little bit more, whatever. I can go either way on this. I think that flexibility is important,
and also some common sense to navigate society.
Situational common
survivable
sense
too. Yeah, situational, exactly.
But it's also important to remember that America is a blend, right? Yes. It's people came here to escape persecution. It happened to be religious in that case, but it could be any number of things today as well. Why people come here. And the reason we're a blend, and I think we're a successful blend for the most part, is because people assimilated to a good degree, but they still allowed that flexibility and they kind of took in everything around them. And I think that's what makes this country great. I would like to talk about the future of migration specifically, not immigration, but like they're similar but different words. Yeah, so like historically, kind of people were born and they died in the same village, right? So you don't really immigrate anywhere. But even, as time went on, and especially today, like JC, he has lived in different countries, right? Yep. He has a home base, but he went and explored the other countries. And so it's interesting to me to think about, like, from a young... Oh, I'm sorry, I missed my actual punchline. So if people go from only being born and living in their village, and then, people are kind of exploring more, even within the United States, they're starting to live in other states than where they were born. Yeah. How is that trend going to continue in the future? I think that people are going to continue immigrating in greater numbers and not just being stuck to where they were born.
100%.
And so it brings me to the question of, I believe that if you want people to change their mindset about immigration, about blending in wherever they do end up, I think it's important to actually teach people from a young age to be more malleable, to kind of inspire them from a young age to immigrate, right?
Yeah.
Don't get stuck just where you're born. And so, like, what's the mindset that you need to teach of be like bamboo when you go to a different country, right? Like, be willing to take risks and get out of your wherever you were born. My parents came here at like 33 years old. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I can't imagine myself at this age moving to a new country, not knowing the language, not knowing the culture.
JC? No, more or less.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's.
I mean, you need the culture, though. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think it's challenging at any age. But I do think that people's mindsets need to shift a little bit, and that requires education. You know, it requires to do something more than we're doing today, which is you can't come here, or this country is willing to allow you to come in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, Max, I think you just nailed it as well. It's going to become very interesting in the medium term because of two reasons. Is immigration as a whole, like it's becoming a more protagonist thing, if you want, in recent years, simply because of the disparity between or among countries. The wealth gap getting bigger is forcing people out of some countries that are struggling with poverty and trying to move, to other countries where there is on paper more opportunity. But also some of these countries that are, at least as of today, more reluctant to allow people in will be forced to allow people in because of such aggressive declining birth rates. So, like, I have an example very, hits close to the heart because I have family that are currently trying to get either the Spanish or Portuguese citizenship to be able to eventually move to Europe. There's not an interest right now in many European countries to give out their citizenship, but with those birth rates declining so aggressively in 10, 15, 20 years, with the social security net contracting accordingly, they'll likely have an incentive to be like, wait a second, we need to allow people in, especially qualified people. So they're going to start offering incentives for people to move to those countries, which will force, to your point, people to be more open about immigration, both immigrants that would maybe not have chosen that country in the first place, but also locals that have never had to deal with immigration, or maybe they had to deal with immigration to a shorter degree, now having to see that country be flooded with either qualified or unqualified talent from abroad. So I think it's definitely the main thing that I find interesting, and you said it towards the beginning of this episode, is like, how is that going to change the culture of those countries that people go to because they look a certain way? But with all this happening, the fundamental nature of those countries will change. So will that be appealing in the first place or not? So
well, their survival will depend on it. Of that nation, right? Like Japan is in that same boat.
Exactly. I don't remember the exact stat right now, but I think it was Korea, not Japan. They have one baby born for every 2 women.
Yeah,
their birth rate is declining aggressively. China's a very open country, and they will have to find a way to attract talent. But this makes it even more interesting. Their culture is not a culture that is particularly attractive to foreigners. I love Japan. Like, I had a phenomenal time when I went there a year and a half ago. It's one of my favorite countries in the world. However, if I look at it from a work perspective, they have a 996 work culture. They work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. What incentive is that to me as a foreigner to go to Japan? It doesn't matter how much money they offer me, whatever it is. They're going to have to change their DNA in order to attract talent and ultimately a guarantee that the country continues to be prosperous. So those kind of questions I think are very interesting. And yeah, we're going to have to, there's no solution that any of us will be able to offer right now, but it will be interesting to see how things unfold in the next couple of years.
Totally. And one last thing about the migration patterns, to just answer Max there, is just that the other element there to consider is climate change and the impact to a lot of regions, especially dry regions, that will have crops just vaporize, right? Places in middle of Africa, places closer to the equator, and that's going to really trigger where people migrate as well. So not only with population decline in these countries like you mentioned, JC, but also scarcity of resources that people need to move to cooler, areas away from the equator, for example, or wet or moist areas. So think of, a reason why, not to get deep into this, sidetrack into this topic, but, Russia's trying to get into Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine is a large breadbasket, and it knows damn well that a lot of those resources are not there in Russia, and it actually has the combination of both the population decline and the resource scarcity that will happen in the near future. So that's a reality. So immigration, in a lot of ways, as much as we're talking about these different aspects of what needs to be fixed, it's actually almost like a lifeline to many countries, including the United States of America,
Yep.
and especially for Europe.
Yep.
But yeah, Max, you're going to say something. Sorry.
Yeah, it also becomes a question of, can you actually afford to immigrate, right?
Yep.
Can you because it's not always that easy. It's not you just buy a plane ticket to JFK. I read this interesting thing yesterday where there's a growing trend of wealthy Americans stacking their passports, right? Meaning they're just like picking up citizenship from other foreign countries, where just in case things turn sour in the U.S., civil war or whatnot, or just like are not as it's not as economical to continue to conduct business here.
Yep.
They are starting to buy citizenship in other countries and potentially move if they need to flee. And so it becomes just another one of those gaps between wealthy and not. It's kind of curious that immigration happens to be
Yeah. I mean,
decided by money. Yeah.
Yep.
100%. At least you have more options, more choice, more safety when you have that money.
Yeah. And one thing, Spence, you were talking a little bit earlier about the responsibility that some countries have and how they should take responsibility, if you want, for driving immigration in many cases. I feel like people are very quick to pull the trigger and associate things such as like, oh, if people from Nicaragua, Venezuela, whatever it is, move to the US, it's a product of US foreign policy. It might be true in some cases, at the same time as like many of those episodes happened like 60, 70 years ago. But you just, I think, touched on a very important contemporary point, which is climate change. So when people from Africa, for example, immigrate to Europe, China, and the US, I don't have the exact number top of mind, but three of them together basically drive like 80 or 90% of climate change in the world. So as much as we might try to recycle
I see what you're saying,
and everything, it's not really us who are responsible. So does a country like the US or Europe have a responsibility to ultimately allow people in if they, along with China, are being the main drivers of these people being expelled by climate change? Like that is what I find particularly interesting. And yeah,
like there's an island in the Pacific that's basically about to sink, or like just because of the rising the levels of water. And the U.S., I think, agreed to take them in. I mean, obviously, a small population, but it's like you guys can come because partly, I think they also did like nuclear testing around those islands as well. So they're like, sorry, like feel free to move here. That's a very small scale version of that, but like
running nuclear testing. Here's the passport.
Just to hone in on one point, though, you guys, which side of the fence? I'm trying to gauge which side of the fence you're on. So it's not really pro-immigration or against immigration. It's about legal immigration.
Yeah.
Right. So like if someone, and so like take any of those scenarios that you just discussed, is there a scenario where even if you illegally come here, we have a duty as fellow humans to keep that person? Or is it always, no, you have to follow the law in order to come here. If not, you will be sent back.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a complicated one that I would probably, if I were to gauge, like let's say there's a meter from 0 to 100, I would say I lean more legal immigration. Like maybe I'm like 70%. I understand that some people just don't have an option and they have to come here for survival, which is why we have actually the, what do you call it? Not refugee. There's
asylum. Yeah.
Which is why we have asylum.
Yeah.
However, I think with the legally, and like I've seen a lot of people that I know closely legally migrate here and go through such a rigid process. I mean, I'm talking about a very rigid process.
You said legal or illegal?
Legal.
Yeah.
They go through such a rigid process that, I mean, it's just tough to really be like, to feel like that it's kind of fair to them in some regard. Not even fair to me as a citizen. Honestly, as a citizen, I could give two craps. I don't care if you come here legally or not, as long as you're not causing problems. But like to see my loved ones who have come here legally and really go through a rigorous process where like they're even on like they're like, oh my gosh, like I hope I'm on good terms and can stay here, and then just see people kind of illegally come and cause a ruckus. It to me, that to me is heartbreaking. That hurts.
I have a stronger stance on this, Max, to be honest. Like, I do believe that immigration should be entirely legal. That being said, based on what Spence just shared and testimony that I've gotten from very close friends and people in my circle, I am aware that the system is absolutely broken, and there's a disincentive for you to apply and do everything by the book because it takes so long.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how qualified you are. The slots available are like very few. When the country acknowledges that it needs immigration in the first place, the US does not have a birth rate issue simply because of how many immigrants come in every year. And if we are aware of that and the talent that immigration brings in all ways, shapes, or forms, not everyone has to be, a Fortune 500 worker, but I would propose that understanding that resources are finite and, both natural and economic, a country does or should have the ability to control how many people they want to allow in. It's just that we need to improve the process because the way that it stands, or as it stands today, like, it's simply not viable. And from the testimonies, again, that I've heard, in many cases, people are doing everything exactly by the book, and yet it's taking, like, the bureaucracy is just mind-boggling. It's taking like a year and a half, 2 years, even 5 years. So even if you're trying to enter illegally, there should be a proper process in order for you to eventually obtain legal citizenship. But I do believe that there has to be a mechanism of control or a path, like a proper path, in order to allow citizenship or legal entry to the country, and not just simply open borders. But
totally, yeah. And to your point, I think like you nailed it. And kind of to tie it back to to your stance, it's like, hey, if somebody comes illegally, they should be confronted about it and say, hey, obviously this should be a very refined process that understands how to communicate, speak with people, have a proper translator. Maybe the future of this should look like this, where it's like, you came here legally, we'll give you the opportunity to become a legal citizen.
Yep.
But you're going to live, you can live here under very limited circumstances, like very limited circumstances. Like maybe you can only stay in a particular state of your residence for the time being. That means you can work. You can only work certain jobs, but we'll work with you in order to get you to where you need to be in order to be a legal citizen. So kind of like a trial run, right? Almost like the demo of like what it is to live here. It's like, look, we cannot just reward you for coming here illegally. You need to work for it now. And that means being able to have limited access to certain things, right? Now, obviously, food and stuff like that you need to live is allow it, but like a graduated citizenship type of thing. And those who come legally, we should reward them a lot more, incentivize them for, hey, you're coming in here, especially those who are they come here professionally, don't commit any, like, zero crime, are working, doesn't even, and I'm not even talking about like even if they're working and they're not, like, they don't need to have like a prestigious job, but hey, they've come here and they're working hard at a plumbing job or a construction job or nurse job, and you see that they have good character and no crime, good record. Those things, that transparency should probably be tracked, and that can determine who can stay here long term. But if you come here, for example, as part of a gang, and now you're just chilling here, trying to recreate similar criminal organized crime, like, you know what, like, nah, that's not, we're not going to accept that. There's no way. That doesn't even make logical sense.
Yeah.
You need to leave. That would be like, get out of here and leave, right?
Yeah. But it's also in their best interest I would create a structure of incentives. So it's in their best interest to do things legally. So to your point is, I mean, it breaks my heart probably to think of like kind of some of the circumstances that people have to go through when they enter the country illegally. But knowing, from based solely on the research that I've done, it seems that they're very limited in what they can do because they're illegal. So if you instead would expand the process and allow them to potentially to make it easier for them to apply, they could, for example, do low-skill jobs that are rewarding, that guarantees them rights, that guarantees them protections. That way they don't feel like they have to hide the law for whatever reason it is, simply because they're illegal. But it seems to me that we solved the problem of immigration in one session.
I don't know what all the controversy is about.
I don't get it. Experts, we don't need them.
We're ready for all.
Yeah, we're right.
I am glad that we took the time to talk about this. I'm sure there's a myriad of points that we haven't even begin to touch or cover, and there's people far more knowledgeable on the topic that should continue discussing it. I do think that it's important for people to just going back to my earlier point, to kind of educate people on how to assimilate, how to immigrate, what is the immigrant mentality and what you should carry with you when you go somewhere. I also think we just need to break down the us versus them points, right? One of those main points, and this is kind of what gives me hope, is speaking different languages, right? So one of the problems becomes, okay, well, this person doesn't speak the language that I do, and so they're not part of us. But I think that barrier will go away eventually, just with technology, right? It's far easier to go into even Japan and speak, and it transcribes for you, and you can have a conversation. That barrier is gone.
Yep.
And so I do think, and I'm hopeful for the future, that once language goes away, and that's no longer the deciding factor of whether this is an outsider or not, and people approach immigration with a different mentality, and do assimilate, but to maybe not as high of a degree as some people would argue for. I think that'll eventually change this country. I think it'll change other countries. I do hope that those borders around the world do start to fade a little bit, and people are more comfortable going somewhere, even in their 30s, or maybe even younger. But I think the three of us do agree that it is far easier to maintain resources to plan for the future if it's legal migration,
Yep.
right? Versus anything else. And I'd love to hear other arguments from people in the comments. Anything else? But let's wrap it up here. Yeah.
All right. Sounds good.
Good talk. Nice having you, JC. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me, guys. Fantastic.
Cut it here, cut it here, cut it here.
No. Let's leave it running so we can hear some extra commentary for those still sticking around.